A few years ago, I came home from work and found my girlfriend on the couch, looking upset. When I asked her what was going on, she said that dreaded phrase no one wants to hear: "We need to talk." She explained that she wasn't happy in the relationship anymore and thought we should take a break, see other people, to help us decide if we should stay together. I didn't want that at all, but I loved her enough to respect her choice, so I agreed. I thought that at least by trying her suggestion, I might win her back. However, a few weeks later, our relationship really came to an end, and I had to move out of the apartment we shared since, technically, it had been hers from the beginning. Obviously, I needed to find a new place to live, and fast. I didn't have time to search for something decent, and I paid dearly for that. The place I rented was a one-room studio in a building that looked like a haunted house. That should have been a warning, but the rent was cheap, the property was available, and the landlord only asked for a 1-month deposit before handing over the keys. Besides, going back to my parents' house wasn't an option. They would have been kind enough to take me in, but for me, it would have felt like a huge step back. So, I chose the studio. The move was smooth. I didn't have many belongings, and honestly, I wasn't in the mood to argue with my ex about who got what. The whole process had already been uncomfortable enough, and I didn't want to make things worse by fighting over furniture. Besides, as long as I had my Xbox and 4K TV, I'd be satisfied. The day after I moved in, I went to the apartment door across from mine to introduce myself to the neighbor. I heard loud thumping music coming from there, so I knew someone was home. When the door opened, I was surprised at how cold and distant the guy seemed. He was young, with a thick, dark beard, and had a Cockney accent. He didn't fully open the door, just cracked it slightly, peeking out. I introduced myself, said I had just moved into the apartment across the hall, and even joked that if he ever needed a cup of sugar, he'd know where to find me. But all I got in return was a nervous, icy stare. I thought maybe I had interrupted him, so I apologized and told him my name was Ali. He replied by saying his name was Jack. It might sound odd, but at that moment I had the feeling he made up that name on the spot. Something told me he had just pulled that name out of thin air, but since I'm not a paranoid person, I just figured he was an odd guy and went back to my apartment. A few weeks later, I was leaving for work when I saw a guy coming out of Jack's apartment. I greeted him, and he responded with a "good morning." I asked if he was a friend of Jack's or maybe a roommate. He answered somewhat vaguely, and that's when I noticed the smell of alcohol on his breath. I repeated the question, pointing to the apartment door and confirming that it was Jack's apartment. He said, "Oh yeah, I'm Jack." In that instant, I realized he was lying, and that's when I started to realize the first guy had lied too. Something strange was happening in that apartment, but I couldn't figure out what it was at the time. This went on for another 2 weeks, with different people coming and going from the apartment at odd hours. Then, when the landlord called to collect the rent for the next month, I asked about the tenants across the hall and who lived there. He thought for a moment and finally replied that the tenant's name was Stephen. He praised him, saying he was the best tenant he ever had. No noise complaints, and he always paid the rent on time on the first of the month by direct deposit. I was about to tell him about the various people I had seen coming and going, but honestly, it wasn't my business, right? I mean, sure, something weird was going on there, but as long as no one was getting hurt, what did it have to do with me? I've never been the type to snitch on others. It's just not in my nature. So, I decided to keep quiet, though over time, I deeply regretted it. About a week later, I was asleep when I was awakened by a sound outside my apartment. It was heavy footsteps coming down the stairs, and I was sure they were connected to the apartment across from mine. Still groggy, I was thinking I would finally make a complaint to the landlord. But before I could do anything, I was startled by a series of loud knocks on my door. "Police! Open the door, or we'll break it down." My heart started racing, and I could literally hear it pounding in my ears. I was frozen for a moment, and it wasn't until after more knocks and another shout that I managed to think straight. I ran to the door, unlocked it, and opened it. The next moment, a flashlight was pointed directly in my face, blinding me as 2 armed officers rushed into my apartment and threw me to the ground. "Hands behind your back, or you'll get shot," one of them shouted, not even giving me time to comply as he cuffed my hands. "Turn on the lights, Rich." the other officer said, as they lifted me to my knees and ordered me to stay quiet. From where I was, kneeling, I saw that 2 more officers were at the door of the apartment across the hall, knocking, but there was no response. Soon one of the officers showed up with a battering ram and broke down the door, shouting as they stormed inside. I thought they were going to drag someone out or act as aggressively as they had with me, but the mood was strangely different. Their tone was almost careful, gentle even. I was confused, listening to the questions they were asking. Are you okay? Do you know where you are? Can you hear us? A minute later, I watched in horror as one of the officers came out of the apartment carrying a girl who couldn't have been more than a teenager. She was poorly dressed, covered in bruises, and her hair, dirty and greasy, was matted to her scalp. When I looked at one of the officers, the shock and disgust must have been written all over my face. Let me guess, you didn't know anything, right? Save it for the interrogation, he said, but I swear I didn't know anything. And I told the police that when they took me to the station. They asked a bunch of questions about human trafficking rings, and I started crying when they tried to get me to confess that I was the leader or something like that. I swore, with all my soul, that I didn't know what they were talking about, and that I would never do something like that. I just didn't have it in me. Eventually they let me go, convinced I had nothing to do with it. But I was deeply disturbed, knowing that something so horrible had been happening right under my nose. I had smiled and joked with some of the bastards who came in and out of that apartment, completely ignorant of the cruelties happening inside. Shortly after, I moved back to my parents' house. I simply couldn't live in that place anymore, and I couldn't bear the idea of looking for another one, not with the intense paranoia of not knowing what could be going on behind the closed doors around me. So, please, as much as your mindset might be to not trust the police, call them if you suspect something strange is happening nearby, because yes, it is our business. It's everyone's business. And that decision could be the difference between someone's freedom and a life of pure suffering. When my wife and I moved to St. Peters, Missouri, it was undoubtedly one of the most significant moments of our lives. I had always had a soft spot for St. Louis, with its French colonial architecture and majestic cathedrals, but the constant hustle and bustle of the city can wear anyone down. There comes a point when the fast-paced life stops making sense, and all you want is a quieter life. It took a while for us to save money and get some promotions in our careers, but once everything fell into place, we decided to take the plunge and make the move. It seemed like we had found our little piece of paradise in the suburbs. St. Peters was a peaceful place, with great schools and over 20 parks spread across the city. In fact, it felt like the whole city was one big park, a true sea of green compared to the concrete jungle that was St. Louis. Besides, the big city was only a half-hour drive away, or 45 minutes in slower traffic, so the move wouldn't affect our careers. We thought we were living the dream. But soon enough, that dream turned into a nightmare, something neither my wife nor I could have predicted. Our house was on Laura Hill Street, and we had a good relationship with our neighbors on both sides. On one side, there was a young couple with a baby, with whom we always had barbecues on the weekends to unwind after a work week. On the other side, there lived a lovely retired couple. They were very quiet and discreet. I mean, they were quite elderly and no longer eager to interact with the neighborhood like the younger folks. I would have been more worried about them if it weren't for their grandson, Jason, who lived with them. He was a nurse at the local hospital and always helped with household chores, making sure they had everything they needed. I was grateful to know they were well taken care of. One time, after returning home from an especially exhausting day at work, I spotted something on the road that stood out completely from the peaceful neighborhood. It was a small, furry figure, stained with the dark red of dried blood. Something lifeless lay at the edge of the perfectly paved road, a dead cat. My heart sank for the poor animal. Whoever hit it, it seemed, hadn't bothered to stop and clean up the situation, which left me both angry and sad. I understand that for some people it might be hard. Maybe they were in shock, afraid of the consequences. But honestly, leaving the cat there, exposed for the neighborhood kids to see, That wasn't appropriate at all. My house was about 100 meters away, so I parked in the garage, grabbed a trash bag from the kitchen and went back to the street. I didn't even greet my wife, which immediately made her realize something was wrong. She followed me outside, horrified to see me wrapping the kitten's body in the black trash bag. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't just throw it in the regular trash like it was any other thing. That kitten was surely someone's pet, and maybe its family wanted to give it a proper burial. I love animals, what else could I do? I stored the fragile body of the cat in the garage freezer and waited for someone to put up missing posters around the neighborhood, hoping to break the news to the family. However, days passed and no posters appeared. A short time later, I took the body to the city animal shelter and tried to move on, erasing the episode from my memory. A few days later, on a humid Saturday morning, I was getting ready for my morning run when I saw the neighbor's grandson getting out of the car with one of those pet carriers. I hadn't had the chance to introduce myself to him yet, so I walked down my driveway giving him a warm "good morning." He responded kindly, and I took the opportunity to ask what he had in the carrier. He explained that it was a new cat he had adopted through Craigslist, something to bring some joy to his grandparents and offer more affection during their twilight years. I thought the gesture was extremely thoughtful, and without mentioning the cat that had recently died in the neighborhood, I suggested he keep the kitten indoors, as cats can get lost and never return. He assured me that was the plan, as his grandmother wouldn't take her eyes off the kitten after seeing how adorable it was. That brought me great relief. I really wasn't ready to deal with the idea of having to put another kitten in a trash bag, not after the last one. So, I told him how lucky his grandparents were to have such a caring grandson, and I went on with my morning run. The next day, the younger neighbor from the house next door knocked on my door and said he needed to talk to me. Silently, I prayed he wasn't coming to cancel our barbecue that afternoon, as it was our turn to handle the meats, and I didn't want to have to put everything in the freezer for a week. Especially considering that, until recently, that freezer had served as a kind of improvised coffin for the dead cat I found on the road. He had a serious expression, so I already figured the barbecue would be cancelled. But the news was even worse. In a low tone, he asked me to follow him to the driveway. I did, and then he asked me a question in the same whispered voice. I'll try to recall the conversation as faithfully as possible. "Did you hear or see anything strange last night?" "I don't think so." "What kind of thing should I have noticed?" "I don't know, something like a cat screaming or something like that." "No, man, I didn't hear anything. What happened? Just come take a look." Fred led me to his front yard, where some rose bushes grew, which I had seen his wife pruning a few times. Under the bushes was another tragic scene, blood and fur scattered around. Another dead cat, but this one seemed to have been attacked recently, torn apart in a way that left me perplexed. "Do you think it could have been a bobcat?" Tim asked. "I don't think bobcats get this close to the city, but I don't know. Anything's possible," I replied, still shaken and not really understanding what was happening. "But if something killed this cat here, right in my yard last night, wouldn't we have heard something?" I should have heard something. I really didn't know what to say. I know in the end it was just a cat, but it terrified us. And I particularly felt even more uneasy, as this was the second dead cat I had found on our street, Laura Hill, in just a few weeks. We ended up deciding to keep an eye on anything suspicious, and later we'd meet for the Sunday barbecue as planned. Before my wife and I headed to Tim's house, I made sure to stop by the other neighbor's house, just to make sure their cat was okay. Shortly after I rang the bell, the neighbor's grandmother opened the door. I had barely begun to ask about the cat when I heard a sharp meow from inside the house. The grandmother apologized, explaining that she needed to close the door before the kitten tried to escape. I smiled, said I understood, wished her a good morning, and went back home relieved. The barbecue that afternoon was a bit awkward. Fred and his wife seemed out of sorts, and in the end, I ended up telling my wife what was going on. 2 dead cats had mysteriously appeared in recent weeks on our street. She was quite shaken, but deep down, I felt relieved that I had told her, because a few days later, something important happened. My wife sometimes works from home, as her job offers a lot of scheduling flexibility. I was at the office in St. Louis when my phone started buzzing with several messages from her. She was asking me to call her as soon as possible, and the topic was about the cats. As soon as I could, I called her back and she told me what had happened. She had run into Jason, the neighbor's grandson, at Walmart and went over to chat. As she spoke, she noticed something strange. His arm was full of scabbed cuts running up and down his forearm, deep cuts. Concerned, she commented that they must have been painful. But Jason just laughed and said the injuries had happened at work when an elderly patient got agitated during a routine procedure at the hospital. But from my wife's trembling voice, I could tell she didn't believe his story. She was certain Jason was lying. Those cuts were from cat claws, and she recognized that kind of scratch from a mile away, having grown up around cats. One scratch in particular was very obvious, parallel lines. And if Jason was telling the truth, that patient would have had to have the smallest hands in the world to leave such characteristic marks. After that, my wife became completely convinced that Jason had something to do with the cat deaths happening in our neighborhood. And her fears only grew when we received a letter from the Homeowners Association. The letter mentioned that several other dead cats had been found in yards and parks around the area, but oddly, no family had reported their pets missing. That's when we became amateur detectives. We were convinced that whoever was killing the cats wasn't just taking neighborhood animals. We thought they were being brought from outside, maybe even bought from places like Craigslist. But we couldn't just accuse Jason of something so horrible. After all, the cat he had brought for his grandparents seemed to be alive and healthy, or at least that's what we thought. One night, my wife was once again spying from the kitchen window, watching the neighbor's house. She had been doing that quite frequently lately, and I was beginning to think her suspicion of Jason was bordering on paranoia. All she ever saw was him taking care of the household chores for his grandparents. But that night, while I was watching highlights from a football game, I heard her scream, "Oh my God!" She ran into the living room terrified. When I asked what had happened, she told me she had just seen Jason taking a trash bag outside. Only the bag looked strangely light, like it had something the size of a cat inside. At that moment, I just wanted to clear everything up once and for all. So I agreed to wait until dark to check what was in the trash cans. When night fell, I made sure no one was around and went over to the neighbor's trash cans to take a look. And there it was, right on top of the trash bin inside a black bag, the body of a dead cat, mutilated just like the one Fred had found in his yard. It was the same cat Jason had bought from Craigslist, the tabby kitten I had seen at his grandparents' house days before when I went to make sure everything was okay. I went back inside as calmly as I could, and without wasting any time, called the police. Within an hour, a squad car pulled up in front of Jason's house. My wife and I watched from the window as the officers spoke with his grandparents before going inside to search. When we saw Jason being led out in handcuffs, my wife couldn't hold herself back. She ran outside screaming insults in pure rage. Days later, the story was all over the news. Jason was formally charged with 12 counts of animal abuse after confessing to the police that he used Craigslist to pick up cats that he tortured and killed. According to his statement, he never intended to care for any of the animals. His plan had always been to strangle them or drown them in his grandparents' backyard. And the worst part, this wasn't even the end of this horrible story, not by a long shot. Jason confessed to the police that he had dismembered some of the cats, cutting off their heads or limbs. He also stomped on the animals' heads before removing them and disposed of the remains by scattering them around the neighborhood in a deliberate attempt to frighten the residents of Laura Hill Street. The last I heard was that he was being held at the St. Charles County Jail with bail set at $50,000, which his devastated and horrified grandparents had no intention of paying. What haunts me most about this story isn't just what Jason did, but the fact that he seemed like the least likely person to commit such acts. He seemed like such a polite young man, always dedicated to his job as a nurse and caring for his grandparents at home. When I met him, I even thought he was almost a saint. But now, all that was just a mask. Jason had something dark inside him, and I'm extremely relieved that we found out before he could hurt anyone else or another animal. Before we move on to the last account, if you're still here, leave a comment sharing your thoughts on today's stories. If you prefer, comment on what time you're watching. Well, let's continue. I grew up here in Germany, and my house was close to an older man's home, where he lived with his wife and their dog in a large, sophisticated house just a few doors down. His wife was much more outgoing than he was, as he always seemed antisocial and grumpy. He rarely exchanged words with any of us neighbors. There was nothing extraordinary about either of them. They just seemed like a typical couple with no children. One morning I left the house at my usual time to catch the school bus. Our residential street was very quiet, and most of the time nothing particularly interesting happened there. Growing up in that place was, in fact, a pretty uneventful experience. However, on that specific day, something felt different. Some of our neighbors were out in the street, and I'm almost certain I overheard a few of them saying there was something strange about the man in the big house. But exactly what it was, I didn't know. I went to school as usual and tried not to think much about it. However, when I returned home at the end of the day, I found the entire street cordoned off and evacuated by the police. Police cars were everywhere, and there was even a GSG-9 truck, which is the German equivalent of a SWAT team, parked nearby. I had no idea what was going on. When I saw my parents near the police barrier, they explained to me that the elderly man had attempted to take his own life, and that his plan was to take the entire street with him. This man had turned the entire basement of his house into a death trap, filling it with gasoline and rigging an explosive in the garden shed. Basically, he had gathered several propane gas tanks, tying them together. Everything was set to explode in the morning, but fortunately, something went wrong. A smaller version of the explosive was placed in the neighbor's trash bin. Before attempting to detonate the bomb, he destroyed the interior of his own house with an axe. Then, he went to the garage, taking the dog with him, locked the gate, started the car's engine, and locked the animal in the trunk. He settled into the driver's seat, waiting to die from carbon monoxide poisoning, as he didn't have the courage to wait for the explosion. Luckily, the plan was thwarted because a neighbor heard the car running and thought it was odd. When he peeked through the garage window, he initially thought the man had suffered a heart attack. He broke the glass to get in, and upon seeing that the man was still partially conscious, noticed the strong smell of gasoline. The neighbor broke into the house and was met with the chaos caused by the man. He immediately called the police, who sent a specialized team to defuse the bomb in time. Unfortunately, the dog didn't survive, suffocating in the trunk. The man was arrested and taken to a mental health institution, where he will remain for the rest of his life. The bomb had the potential to destroy several houses and cause extensive damage to the neighborhood. This incident happened in 2010 in the city of Ingolstadt, and it made headlines on all German news outlets. You can look it up. I'm not making this up. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click on the notification bell to be alerted to all future narrations. I post new videos here every day. I hope to see you in the next ones. Now on the screen, I'll leave 2 other great videos that I know you'll enjoy. See you there.